Welcome, Irina, and welcome everyone.
Thank you. It's good to be back. It's great to hear from many of you and a lot of follow-ups from our last course, and let's keep the conversation going as well. So for anyone who I haven't met, I lead a product marketing team at LinkedIn. I've been at LinkedIn since 2011, so quite a number of years, and for the most part has spent most of my career in the tech industry, either in marketing or in operations. And bringing you some of the strategies that I personally have gone through as a professional, but also as a hiring manager and as being someone who's on the MBA interview panel. I wanted to give you some of the tips and actually chat through some of these things. So I generally am not going to bore you with a ton of slides. I simply put together a couple of slides in order to give us some guidance points. And just some visuals so that we can actually have some of these jump off points. But I'll get in and out of the deck as we are progressing with the course. So what we'll cover today will hopefully be a starting place for you to feel a little more ready, both for in-person interviews when they do start to happen, but also virtual interviews. Virtual interviews can sometimes be even tougher. So I just wanted to pull in some of the meetings best practices, which are essentially what interviews are. And so 3 different things that we'll cover. First is there are different types of interviews. And while you may be experiencing more or less a standard format as you're coming out of school, as you evolve as a professional, as you're post-MBA or post-grad, you're going to encounter different types of interviews with different types of companies. So we'll walk through those. Your physical and mental readiness is super important, so we'll cover that. It includes some of those questions. And then the resources that you can lean on. So I'll share some of those with you as well. I actually am going to pause the video for a moment. I wanted to see, and if those who feel comfortable raising their hand, undoing their video, how many folks have done interviews? And keep your hands raised up. How many folks have done more than 5? More. Okay. More than 10? Awesome. Well, Iris and I have done more than 10 and Jacob too. So we'll share what we've been through, all the good and all the bad. And so it'll be fun. Interviews are an interesting thing. They're awkward meetings between strangers. It's kind of like a speed date, so you kind of have to put your best foot forward. But just like in relationships, it'll either work out for the best for both parties, or maybe it wasn't meant to be. So let's just cover some of the things here. So I'll go back to my screen and take it from here. So one of the things that I wanted to ask, to take you through is my interview journey. Tell you my personal story of where I've been, just so that we can kind of ground. So I graduated in 2008, but I started to look for a job. I wanted to go to school full-time and work full-time. So I started my first real job interview in 2006. It was for a small little company in New York doing digital DVD and CD production. And so I was introduced through a friend, but I still had a formal interview. So I went in and I met with the CEO of the company, and he basically gave me a very lightweight assessment. So it was a half an hour interview. Yay, I got the job. In 2009, when I graduated, I was looking for my kind of the real job. So it was the first time I interviewed at a global company. And for me, I probably applied, I mentioned to you guys, I probably applied to like over 100 jobs. In 2008, it was really bad. So in early 2009, I landed this interview, and it was the first interview that I got, and I actually got it. I like could not believe it. But it was also the first time ever I've interviewed at a global company. And so I interviewed with the hiring manager and just a handful of people, but their interview process was fairly straightforward. Now, in 2011, I applied to LinkedIn. I wanted the job at LinkedIn, and this was the first time I ever had my interview panel. So what that meant was I had a screener with a recruiter, I had a one-on-one with a hiring manager, and then I had a full-on panel and a case. So it was like the full traditional, what I would call the full interview panel. that happens now. And then in 2017, passive interviews are really interesting because as you progress in your career, you're going to have recruiters reach out to you. So you may not be looking for a job. You may be completely content and happy, but then they're like, hey, this is a really great opportunity. Your background looks amazing. Do you want to have an exploratory conversation? Exploratory conversation means interview, but you are more or less interviewing them to see if you want to actually take that leap. And then in 2018 was the first time I was encountered with, I was actively looking for a role. I was moving from the West Coast to New York. And I interviewed at a bunch of different companies, and I actually got to the final stage with 3 companies. And I didn't realize how stressful that would be because at that point in time, they weren't interviewing me. It was much more of, I was interviewing them to figure out what company was the right fit for me. And then as I was looking back at looking to come back to LinkedIn in 2019, it was similar experience where I wanted to figure out what was right for me. So there's always a balance as you go through your career of the first job is I'll take anything. And as you progress in your career, there's going to be many more nuances to these interviews. And so I wanted to kind of do another check-in with you guys and hear from you. What's the most stressful part of interviewing for you? And I can share mine. And it's those hypothetical questions. What would you do if you were running X? So it's the brain teasers. I can generally speak to most of my traditional questions. It's those brain teasers that are really stressful for me. Iris, maybe you can share, since you've done so many interviews as well. What are some of the most stressful parts for you?
Yeah, so I think for me, I did mostly like product interviews, and I think I got pretty good at like product design questions, but I'm always stressed when it comes to like technical questions because I didn't come from like a CS background. I know some kind of CS. So when they ask me, okay, what is the architecture of this like code base or like database? How is data stored? So I think those kind of questions, like I would know a little bit, but I'll be pretty stressed.
How do you handle those questions when you're really stressed? What do you do?
So I would just think out loud. Like I would tell them whatever I know about like the foundation, the architecture, and then kind of think through the process. Sometimes I don't get to the right answer in the end, but they know like how I think. And whenever I have a problem that I don't know, I'll tell them about like, so I don't know the answer to this question, but if I were to look for the answer, I would go to like this kind of resources. I'll ask my colleagues, or well, basically like how I would seek for help.
Thank you. Is anyone else willing to share?
I can go.
Yeah.
I think for me, like I don't know if anybody else had experience with this, but like panel interview, very stressful. Like I don't know, something about like talking to like kind of one person, but then like other people kind of like chiming in or like kind of just observing, I think is it can be very stressful.
And how have you managed those in the past?
Well, so it only happened once. So I guess for me, I was just sort of like try to just like focus as much as I could on like the person that I was talking to kind of like, I guess, calm my nerves.
That's a great strategy. Panel interviews can be really interesting. Panel interview can be with all the people in one room, or a panel interview can also be one person. You meet each person one at a time, and then they come back together. So it's really interesting. Or you can meet 2 at a time. And Levy, that's a really good question. A panel, generally, it depends on the company and it depends on the role that you're being interviewed for. A panel, most of the time, if you have, so the way an interview can be structured in a couple of different ways. You can have a panel, which is usually 3 to 4 people. So it's your hiring manager and they bring in 2 cross-functional, or a hiring manager and they bring 2 other teammates. And you are either doing a presentation or they're asking you questions. They generally don't do any more than 3 when questions are being asked. A lot of times there'll be a topical interview. So for example, for product marketing, you have cross-functional partners on data science and engineering. So you'll have potentially 2 people asking you questions about your technical competencies. You may have a marketing manager and a brand manager asking you questions about your storytelling abilities, and then you have your teammates doing an assessment on culture. So it really depends, but one thing I would highly recommend is actually asking your recruiter when you're having that conversation, all of this information, because it's helpful for you to mentally manage when you have to walk into a room and I've been in a panel where there are 9 people. And I was like, what? Like, I have to present and 9 people are going to ask me questions, because it changes the dynamic quite a bit. One more experience. Oh, Levy, don't get nervous.
I'd say for me, the most stressful part is probably just right before the interview. Yeah.
Just a little butterflies and jitters.
Yeah, and I mean, at that point I can just pretend it's going to go much worse than it will actually will and all that. Yeah.
And how do you cope?
I mean, I just try to stay calm.
It helps. Sometimes, and different people have different. For me, whenever I have the nervous jitters, it's just a matter, and for me, it's about initial 20 seconds. And so those are the moments where I have found that it works for me to take control of the room in a more personal way. So I'll connect with them, or I'll ask them a question, because if you ask the other person a question, one, people love when they are asked questions, and because they can talk about themselves, but 2, it actually puts you in control of the room. So it's actually, and it kills that really weird, awkward silence. And so it's really nice to be able to take control. We'll come back to some of these a little bit more, but I'll actually take you through some of the actual interview types, and then we'll go through the questions. Come on, Zoom. All right. So I oversimplified, and engineering will a lot of times have a lot more structured interviews, but these are, for the most part, especially if you're interviewing for a company that's like medium to large size, where you have departments, you'll probably have multiple people. So you generally always have a screener interview, and while these are very quick, very anxious, they're also kind of your entryway to the rest of the interview. You can have a screener before you are entered into a program. You can have a screener before you are proceeding with the rest of the interview. So a screener is usually a fairly quick call with either your hiring manager or the HR person. The panel is what I talked about, and it's either people sitting in a room and assessing you on your performance, or asking you questions, or it's one after the other. And then you can have a case interview. So you are either given one to do at home, or you are put on the spot and told to use the whiteboard, which is also a little stressful and anxious for me. So when it comes to a screener, the most important things to consider here is the interview really sets the tone for the rest of your interview process. This is where you're getting to meet the recruiter or the hiring manager, and for the first time actually have a conversation that's very specific to the role. So one thing to keep in mind is by this time they should have already seen your resume or your LinkedIn profile or whatever it is that tells them about the basics. This is your opportunity to fill in the additional basics. The time management is the most important thing here, because what I'll encounter a lot of times when I'm interviewing people during the screener is they'll ramble on for a long time, and they run out of time by telling me all the basics that I will already known from the resume. And so in the 2 minutes, having introductions and set expectations, generally the interviewer takes control there. But once you get into this competency assessment, having very clear and concise answers to those questions that you have prepared, and being very on point and being able to ask follow-up questions is going to be really important, because at the last 5-minute Q&A, the questions that you ask are nearly as important as the ones that are asked of you, because that is your way of, that's one of the ways that they can assess your critical thinking. Because if there's let's say in a real setting, if there's a meeting and I'm presenting and having a conversation with somebody, and at the end of that conversation, they don't have not one question about what I just told them, there's a potential sense of disinterest. And so one of the tactics that you can have is some of these more specific as you're doing some active listening on what they're telling you in the initial introduction, just following up on that. The panel is usually 3 to 5 minutes. This is generally a much longer. These are 30 to 45 minutes each. So when we have on-site, or when we had on-site interviews and now we have Zoom interviews, you are going to have 4 interviews, each lasting about 30 to 45 minutes. And you'll generally meet with the hiring manager, with a cross-functional team, and probably 1 or 2 of the teammates. This is where with each of the person, you have your introductions, kind of kick off, have some of those relatable conversations, and then they'll ask you very, very specific questions. These are the types of interviews where those really important, tell me about yourself, what are your strengths and weaknesses type of questions come in. And then at the end is kind of the 5-minute Q&A, which is also really important. This is the most important time where you can assess whether this is the right culture fit, what kind of barriers and challenges they face, what is the long-term sustainability of the company if it's a startup, and the viability. And so those are the moments where you can really dig in with your curiosity. And then one of the things with the panel is when you're interviewing for 3 hours, you get really tired. And so this is where you want to strengthen your mental state. And you're probably going to repeat yourself multiple times. And some of the things that I've seen as being the last person on an interview panel, and if I ask them a question to tell me something about like a challenging experience that they had, there are candidates that are just frustrated saying it for the 3rd time. And it's like, whoa, I get that you had to repeat it, but I wasn't here. So there's an element of frustration that also comes in. So it's just important to keep that endurance. And then for the actual case, this is where you'll either know exactly what you've got going for you. And for the most part, whenever I've seen a case, not enough information is given. And so one of the things is you actually should follow up if you don't have enough information and ask the recruiter if you're able to get, let's say you have to put together a plan, but you're not given any numbers, any budgets, any timelines. So you can always follow up and say, hey, I needed some of the constraints in order to really bring this to life. Can you tell me X, Y, and Z? And most of the time they'll say, oh yeah, of course, like, let me get that for you. Or they can just be like, no, just assume. And so that's just an important thing to realize is in your real world, whenever you're solving problems, you're never going to have enough information. So you're going to have to kind of pull it from different sources. And so it's okay to ask for this information, especially if you don't have the research and the data in order to make that decision. And I couldn't stress enough before we get to the practice portions, the preparation for interview and doing your research. Because if you don't do your research, it can get really awkward and not that kind of like manageable awkward. If you have a 45-minute interview, but you haven't read up on current events or the industry, that can be kind of devastating. But also if you read up on the culture and the company, it'll help you connect with the people that are interviewing you and understand the things that they care about and the things that they're looking for in a candidate. Because a lot of times there'll be multiple buckets. One thing I would say is if you're interviewing at a company, you can always go to About Us page and look at their cultures and values. Many companies will put up their cultures and values. And if you can see what is this company really about and what do they care about? Because there are some companies whose culture and values will be like, get shit done and be productive and get things like shipped. And like, it's all about like speed and results. And if you're just talking about the like softer side of things, it may not resonate with a person who's looking for someone who's like going to drive stuff. Or you can have a company that's much more empathetic and compassionate and cares about various kind of ecological things. That's where you may want to lean in on that experience. So kind of know what you're going into versus just having a blanket for all the companies. And this is where I think you can use LinkedIn to both look at their company page. You can look at the people that currently work there and what kind of profiles they have, especially if you're going into a project management role, but you want to be a COO one day. You can see what path did the COO take. And you can also, as you have your interview panel, you should always know who you're speaking with in advance If you don't have that information, reach out and ask. The recruiter is supposed to support you. And so I would say that's where you reach out and really stress the information that you need in order to make this happen. And then practice is the most awkward thing, but it helped me so much. Or sometimes even just answering these questions out loud over and over again with yourself, to your dog, cat, mirror, helps a lot, because you listen to yourself say these things out loud, and especially over video, it can be so tiring. This is like, even hearing myself talk for 20 minutes, I'm like, oh, it's exhausting. So in an interview, when you are trying to create a great first impression, you're trying to be concise, just nail that story in advance. But one thing I'd say is, with the questions, you'll probably never be able to nail every single one of them. During an interview, especially when you have multiple people present in a room, I would assume that everyone is weighing in, and usually the most quiet person is also the most important one. They are observing, so there are observers, and then usually that person will ask one really hard question at the end. It's my experience. When you're answering the questions, answer it with that specific job in mind. So even if it's a challenge that you've experienced in the past, how you overcame it, or the resources that you used. And then I couldn't stress enough making the conversation enjoyable. Like, you are being interviewed to join a job, which is basically going to take up, you're going to spend more time with these people than you're spending with your friends or family. So having a great interpersonal connection is so important. So bring your whole wonderful, excited self, so that you can actually have a good and engaging conversation. And you can always relate to the things that make you happy or make you excited. If you don't know something, don't try to BS. Just either say, I don't know, or take a path of, I haven't had that experience in the past. I imagine the way that I would approach it is this. Because if you start to BS and they dig in, like, the last thing that they want is like a dishonest person. And then don't let your guard down. Your interview is not done until you get the offer. So I would say this is where, whether you're in-person interviews that transition into happy hours, or whatever the interview process is, I would say it continues until you have the job offer. So I would say keep your composure and stay professional. I pulled some of the questions that I think James will help us coordinate into different rooms, so that you can actually, in smaller settings, be able to workshop some of these. The most important thing about an interview is what you're actually bringing, and how you're framing yourself, and how you're speaking about your experiences, especially where you haven't had the exact experience. So things like, tell me about yourself, or your greatest strengths and weaknesses, or something around your challenges or the most challenging project. When you practice with somebody else, feedback is such a gift. They're able to tell you in a very direct way how you're coming off, or if you're rambling. So I'd say, James, maybe you can break us out into rooms, and when you're in your rooms, I would just say, just take a turn, pick one question and answer that question. And even if it's on the spot, it's okay. And then give each other feedback on the approach and how you are actually coming up with that.
Sure. Do you want me to give this 10 minutes, 5 minutes?
It's 28 and I want to leave some time for Q&A at the end. Why don't we do 10 minutes and then we'll come back, and then
Okay.
we can kind of assess and do some Q&A and share some experiences.
Sounds good. When I do this, it happens automatically. You'll be sent to a room, but if you want to just pop back in, you can just leave the room and then join the main one again.
Sounds good. I'll join the room.
All right. I will set these rooms up here.
Thanks, James. This will be fun.
Yeah, of course. And I just wanted to say I put this this slide right here in the Slack event discussion. So if you don't have these written down, then just reference that so you can use that, because you're going to lose that screen right there. So that said, I'll open the rooms up, and yeah, thanks, Irina.
probably something that's negative in some contexts but useful in others, and not something that's entirely bad. But where's the balance in that? Should it be like one negative trait and one associated positive trait? Should it be something that's mostly negative, but you explain how you can overcome it or put it to use? What's your take?
So as the hiring manager, I value honesty. It's a pet peeve when people try to say something negative and shape it into a positive. We were actually talking about that in our smaller group. The reason for that question, well, one is for at least for me, is to set. It's a really awkward question that creates a lot of awkwardness, by the way. So I don't know how many hiring managers actually like to ask the question, but when they do, I think this is where you can actually explain, like share a weakness. But one best practice that I'd share there is think of, because this is more of like get the cat out of the bag situation. Like, what are they going to expect? What's the like worst thing that can happen? Granted, you probably won't share that in an interview, but like, even if let's say time management, like prioritization historically, I'm so passionate about my work, I tend to take on more projects than I can handle. One caveat to this weakness question is share how you're working on it. Because if you have a weakness, I'm bad at prioritization, I'm consistently overloaded. The way that I've been working on it is reading this book, which is really helping me put things into perspective. That way you're sharing a real weakness that your hiring manager, whoever is interviewing you, actually legitimately knows that they can work on this with you, and that they can coach you through this, and that you're honest and you're explaining how you're actually going through that. So if, for example, like I'm not as good with change, or like change management, it's not so much a weakness, but more of it is a weakness, but it's also a fear, but it's also something that your manager should support you with as you're entering your kind of early adulthood or your early careerhood. It is really intimidating. So one thing you can say is, I'm learning from others how they manage change, or I'm attending these different sessions or practice sessions to understand how others cope with it, so I can understand the different types of frameworks. So that's something I'm working on. So that's the way I would say like weakness can really be shaped. I wouldn't shape a weakness into a strength. I would put what the weakness is and what you're doing about it.
Thank you.
That help?
Very helpful.
And then the same thing with the strength. It should be very practical and applicable. What other questions came up, or any other observations?
Yeah. So one thing that our group was trying to do is really trying to balance, like really saying everything, like, or really try to answer the question to the best of our ability, but also kind of be concise. Do you have any tips on like how to do both?
For a lot of these questions, for each of you, I encourage you to build out bullet points for these and have an answer or two, so that down the line, 10 minutes for 3 people in an interview to handle one question is actually a lot of time when you're in a real interview. So the best practices I would give there is I'll share with you on LinkedIn. There's a interview practice questions. And like I said, you're not going to be able to answer every single question there is out there. But what you can do is, if you have bullets on tell me about yourself, really the most important things that someone should know, and whether you're qualified for this job, your greatest strengths and weaknesses is what you're going to be praised for, and where your manager is going to have to coach you. Why do you want to work here? It is generally connected to your culture and values and the passions of where you want to be. Because if you are passionate about the environment, but you're going into a banking company, chances are you're not going to be an employee that's going to be retained for a long time. So that question is more about your happiness and your long-term strategy. Tell me a time that you showed leadership. It's an example. It's how in an unstructured situation, you're able to reflect back on an example. These tell me about a time. I would say like these are one of the hardest to keep concise, and these are the ones that I would say build up the bullets for. Absolutely. Tell me about a time you showed leadership, about a time you had a conflict, about a time that you had to carry somebody else's weight, about a time you had to prioritize. So some of the critical pieces of the role, tell me about a time, helps bring it to life. It also puts you on the spot. So I think having the really clear examples of what you've done and aligning to those will really help. So my biggest advice would be like, unpack the tell me about, because those will also help you tell the story about yourself. What would your coworkers say about you? This is a really interesting one. My best practice there is it should be something that is of value to you. It's not that you're able to drive a project to completion. This was an example with our group, but it's the energy that you bring to bring people together to complete these projects, or it's your how much you value relationships and bringing people together in harmony. It's how you value precise data and making sure you're making data-driven decisions. So it's not just the action that you're taking, it's the consistency with which you do it. That would be I think the best practice here that I've used that has worked for me. Most challenging project just generally helps understand what scope and complexity you've managed in the past, so that as you're embarking on a role, the manager, the hiring manager, or the team can understand where you'll require coaching. Because if you're leading a global brand, but you've done one marketing email, like there's a big disconnect there. Managing conflicting priorities is about your prioritization skills. It's a time where you had to say no to something, and the ability to say no to something is just such a hard skill that you will just, as you get more and more and more senior, that's just going to be probably one of the more difficult things you'll have to do. And then where do you see yourself in 5 years is a question more for the hiring manager and for more for you to be able to know where your head's at on what path you want to follow. Because if you're interviewing for a company that doesn't have a specific role assignment, you're put into a bucket. And if there's kind of a passion area for you, you can then have a bigger trajectory. So that's where with each of these questions, I think in your own mind, understanding the why behind the questions will actually help you answer these questions better. Yara, is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you so much. I've been taking notes on every single question that you just asked, so thank you so much.
Sure, and so I'll make sure that we share the link with you guys. But on LinkedIn in the Jobs tab, there's an interview prep section, and there are a bunch of questions there. And within each question, there's an overview and an answer framework. I think those will help you, and there's a lot here. I pulled some of the ones that I thought were most relevant. There's a lot here, and they're depending on the industry as well. So I would just encourage you to go in those and practice them. But I think the best thing that you can do is get those bullets and just practice them time over time. And as you build up your experience, whether you're coming out of high school, whether you're coming out of college, whether you're doing post-grad, whichever area you're in, the person interviewing you will have that's part of expectation setting. Like, you're not going to be expected to have this like crazy complex project that you drove with global managers if you're coming out of like your first year of undergrad. So the questions that are being asked will probably be appropriate to that, but I would just use that filter of like, why? What was the most challenging question for folks?
I think for me personally, the one about your coworkers was the hardest.
What would your coworkers or your classmates say about you?
Well, so I just think it was difficult because like trying to frame what like other people think about me, I think was hard. Like I have a general sense or an idea of it, but like putting it into words and in a couple sentences was like difficult.
What would you want them to think about you?
I would hope they think that I'm like determined and like in anything I'm passionate about is what I would hope.
And so how would you go about making sure that they know that?
I'm probably just gonna keep trying to do that by like showing that I can do things and like making sure things get done probably.
One other thing you can do is as you're working with your colleagues, tell them what's important to you. So for me personally, I really value relationships. It's just so hugely valuable when I work with different like teams. I work with people, and for me to care, and a lot of times I'll say that going into a project at the kickoff, I'll say it'll be great to get this done, but I really care about the relationships that are being shaped here. And so I think one of the things that you can do is help people not assume, especially as you're building and you're going through it. What you just said, those are your values, that you're determined and you want to be seen as determined. So I think that's just going to be an ongoing practice. It's a question that I think has been popping up more frequently recently. It's just a really fun question. So I'd say have fun with it. I wanted to also open up the floor for you guys to be able to ask questions. Anything about interviewing or questions that you're able to ask prep. I want to open the floor for you guys.
I was kind of interested in maybe like kind of what your thoughts on like how to maybe like go through like the sort of the so tell me about yourself kind of question, and maybe more into like what it's sort of like its purposes and like what like how I should think of it, because sometimes I get a little like tell me about yourself, like what are they kind of looking for?
So tell me about yourself sets the tone for the rest of the interview. So when I say tell me about yourself, the context that I have in my head is I've read your resume and I've read your LinkedIn profile. So I have the bullet points of what you've done end to end, but there's no color. I don't know which of these are the most important to you, which ones were the hardest for you, which ones did you gain the most experience, which one was the most transformational for you. It's just, they're bullets on a paper that have no weight associated to them. So tell me about yourself actually allows you to lean on your experience and say the things that you value or that's been important to you, the projects that you've driven that were really challenging or difficult or that you're proud of. You can also relate to the things that are really applicable to this role. So if you're interviewing for an accountant role, but you actually haven't had any background in that, you can always talk about why accounting was an area of passion for you, what inspired you about that area, and what you want to do. Like this is where you can actually take some of the other questions. This is actually a really good strategy. You can take some of the other questions, like where do you want to be in 5 years? What would your coworkers say about you? A time that you showed leadership, and you can actually pull these into your story. Tell me about yourself allows for the interviewer to build on the questions. So a lot of times the questions that I would have, for example, I have a library of questions that are in my head, but I generally like to have the conversation flow. And so as you tell me about yourself, there's an area that you're going to be really passionate about. I'm going to double click into that area and I'm going to say, well, tell me about that. Can you tell me a time when this happened? And then you'll tell me that. So the story will then narrate from the tell me about yourself. But the one mistake that people make is the tell me about yourself. You'll just go into the library of everything that you've done. It's more of a just here are the things that I'm really excited about, how they apply to this role. And as you can see from my experience, like I did this, this, and this. There are a couple of questions in the chat. Feel free to unmute and jump right in.
Yeah, I just have, it's a question more on the basics of the interview. So if you get the chance to, or if you have the opportunity to schedule a time frame for your interview, what do you think are the best times to do it? Because sometimes it might be convenient for you, but not necessarily the best time for that interview.
I would say get that information from your recruiter. Ask them as many questions as possible so that it should be at a time where you're alert and that makes for you. I don't think there's the best time of day particularly, but your recruiter or the hiring manager should have the best idea. You also ideally want to have the interviews fairly close together versus like weeks apart. So I think it'll just depend on the type of interview that you have. Some interview processes can take a long time, especially if I've had interviews that were stretched across like a month between when you have your screener, like the following week or the week after that, you have your on-site, the following week or the week after that, you have your presentation. So ideally, they'll be a little closer together. That staggering of timing is going to become much more important when you're potentially juggling multiple interviews and multiple offers, because you generally want to line them up so when your on-sites are happening at the same time, so that if you have multiple offers potentially coming, you can ask the question, the follow-up questions, schedule follow-up meetings, and give yourself that time and space. Let's see. Namarada, do you want to jump in?
Yes. So my question is around, what makes candidates stand out? So if there are two people who have similar kind of profiles in terms of education, how can they differentiate themselves in interviews? And do you have any experiences, like can you note down some of the memorable interviews that you've had with candidates? Like what stood out for you?
I would say the passion that they had for the role, and the passion shows up in the research that they've done about the company, or how they're able to answer the question and relate that experience. So I've taken this course and I've read on the current, like from what I see in the trends, like the company is moving in this direction. It's just a much more like leaning in approach, not too much, not the gifts that I think it was Amanda that shared with you. But it's bringing your whole self. Then I think the energy that you bring, and then the way that a lot of times you can answer one question in two very different ways, align it in a very kind of critical thinking way that elaborates and ties to the experience of the role. And so there'll be two very similar candidates with different backgrounds. So one candidate will say like, I did this and this and this and this. And the other candidate says, I did this, and the way that it can apply to this role, or from the job description, I can see that you want me to be able to like manage projects. I'm confident I can do that. So it's more of the connecting the dots for the person who's interviewing them, so that I don't have to do that myself. I think that's really helpful. And those examples, I think are key. Tell me a time when. It brings things to life, because if you're stumbling, which is totally okay. Like you can, in an interview, by the way, if you need time to think, I just need a moment. That's actually a good sign. I mean, don't do it with every question, but if you're asked, tell me about a time when, you led a team of something, and you're like, can I just take a moment to think? Like, that's actually like, collect your thoughts. That's absolutely okay to do. Or if you're asked for an analytical question.
Thank you.
Sure. Iris?
Yeah, so I have a more specific questions, because I have like 2 final round interviews coming up for both Unity and Microsoft. And so my problem is that they're in a pretty big industry. Like Unity's in the gaming industry, Microsoft is in like every industry. So I feel like it's harder for me to like do the research and show that I understand the company very well. So how would you advise on like doing industry research while like showing that I know the company, while not going too deep that they started asking me questions that I don't know about?
You can always, with much bigger companies that have multiple industries, a company like Microsoft, I would look up the hiring manager and the department that they're in, the scope of the work. If it's a general product management role, I would just lean in much more on the role and what the role entails at Microsoft, or the experiences of people who have product manager roles in the past, and lean in on that more. The industry which Microsoft's in is like very wide and very vast. So that's where I would actually over-index on the person that's interviewing you, or the panel that's interviewing you for those final interviews. And what I would focus on, what does results look like? So for you to drive results, what that means, how you get there, and the leverage that you're able to create. And then what type of a leader are you, or what type of a leader are you going to be working with, so that you're putting together how you're going to lead, how you're going to create leverage with this bigger team, and then how you're actually going to drive results.
Got it. So like what type of leader I am.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
And how you would approach, and of course, as your career evolves, there'll be more and more leadership opportunities. But even in your product management role or a marketing manager role, you're leading. And so what values do you embody?
Got it. Thank you.
Let's do one more question.
I got one more question. So you've mentioned about a lot of things about what sort of things you might want to ask an interviewer, but what are the sort of things that you shouldn't ask an interviewer that they might be insulted that you just didn't read the website or something like that?
I don't think that anyone will get insulted necessarily, or think anything. A question is a question. I think you should ask the questions that are going to be most useful for you to make a decision on whether this is the right role for you, or whether this is the right company for you. What does the growth trajectory for this type of role look like? Or usually as they're telling you about the role, or if there's something that aren't super obvious in the job description, that's where you would lean in more on. Or like, what type of management style do you have? You can ask them more about how the team has come together. When was the team originated? I would ask questions that allow you to then like pretend you have multiple companies. How would you assess whether this is the right company for you? So I would just ask them that more pointed question versus something that's more vague. I think that's the most important thing, is the question that you're asking should have some connection to the why this role. Like the things that will generally matter to you is the culture of the company, the manager, the dynamic of the team, what results look like, what challenges and barriers the company or the team has, what they're most excited about on their roadmap or whatever industry they're in, the thing that they're driving towards. What is inter-team cross-functional dynamics that are going to be impacting you? So I'd say like those are some of the things that you can ask about that will actually be really helpful for you to know and understand, especially like what's their greater weakness.
All right, thank you.
Of course. Guys, as always, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. You can reach out and I will answer all of your questions to my best ability. Interview is going to be a journey. I mean, I'm still on my journey and will continue to be on it. And so there are going to be good interviews. There are going to be ones where you're going to walk away and they're not going to be the best. And then there's going to be those that you land your opportunity. You just need one at a time. And so just prepare, do your research so that you can be well informed. I think that's the most important part, is you're doing it for you.
Awesome. Irina, thanks so much for spending a second session with us. This was really, really helpful and also good to break up and get these sort of these practices into play. So yeah, toss her a emoji in the Zoom. So I think everyone has these new reactions. I'll give it a party emoji. But thank you. This was awesome. And everyone should take Irina up on the offer to connect on LinkedIn and follow up with her later. Please make sure that you do fill out the feedback form so we can keep making events like this and keep making them better as we go. But yeah, I just want to say thank you. If you're watching on the YouTube, make sure to keep an eye on the calendar for more events like this. And with that, I'll let everyone enjoy the rest of the Thursday. Thanks so much, Irina.
Thanks, guys. Let me know how I can help. Always happy to come back.
Really, really appreciate it. Thank
Always.
you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.